Okay, so the second major class of postsynaptic receptor, and these can also be, by the way, presynaptic receptors. You can find ionotropic receptors presynaptically or postsynaptically. The same is true of the second class. These are called metabotropic receptors, and they also have another very commonly used designation that I'll get to at the end of this video. But metabotropic receptors, also like the ionotropic receptors, are going to bind a neurotransmitter. Also like the ionotropic receptors, they're embedded in the membranes, either presynaptically or postsynaptically. And just like ionotropic receptors, when they bind neurotransmitter, the neurotransmitter always comes extracellularly, and it stays extracellularly. And if we're talking about a neurotransmitter binding to the metabotropic receptor, it'll bind, cause a change in shape. That happens to every receptor. When they bind something, when they receive their chemical, they shift their structure, their conformation, which alters their function, and then typically they also then release the neurotransmitter and return to their original structure. Now we're going to see there are some very complex responses that these receptors can make also, but that's generally what's going on. But while the ionotropic receptors, when they bind a neurotransmitter, right, they actually result in the opening of a hole or channel, from the outside to the in to let ions cross and allow for rapid redistribution of ions again, right, and some either hyperpolarization, right, or depolarization of the membrane. So very quick kinds of changes in the polarization, either excitation, depolarization towards the threshold of -55, or hyperpolarization, basically increasing the difference in charge, taking you away from the threshold for the initiation of an action potential. Metabotropic receptors are a little bit more complex. So again, here, this is supposed to be like a metabotropic receptor embedded in the membrane. This is the outside of the cell. This is the inside of the cell. Here, on the inside of the cell, you're going to find an attached, what we call a G protein. And this G protein can actually have many different forms. The G protein is a whole class of G proteins. There's GI, there's GS, there's GO. So different receptors, different metabotropic receptors will be attached to different G proteins on the inside. And when a neurotransmitter binds extracellularly to the metabotropic receptor, there is a change in shape, right? And the change in shape results in the release of the G protein. Now, this G protein, when it is released, can do many different things inside the cell. And we're going to talk about some of those things that it might do. But it can influence, the metabolism of the cell is one of the things that they sort of suggest, which is why it's referred to as a metabotropic receptor. But these receptors that are coupled here to G proteins on the inside and release them upon the binding of a ligand of a chemical, of a neurotransmitter or a drug, right, potentially. These are also given another name. They're called G protein coupled receptors, or GPCRs. So you'll see often in research papers and laboratories, and if you meet grad students in the advanced class, so you'll hear them talk about GPCRs, or G protein coupled receptors. These are the metabotropic receptors. They're receptors embedded in the membrane that bind neurotransmitter extracellularly, change their shape, and as a result release a G protein that can then go off and do many other